In September 2022, four massive explosions ripped through the Nord Stream gas pipelines at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. The blasts were so powerful they registered as earthquakes. Europe's energy supply was crippled overnight. The world focused on who did it and why. But intelligence agencies were asking a different question. If someone can blow up pipelines 300 feet underwater without getting caught, what else can they destroy down there? The answer keeps military planners awake at night: the cables. Right now, beneath the ocean, there are roughly 550 undersea cables carrying 99% of all international data. Every email you send overseas, every video call, every financial transaction, every classified military communication, all of it travels through fiber optic cables lying on the ocean floor, often in predictable locations, largely undefended. And the terrifying part? Severing just a handful of these cables could cripple entire continents. Today, we're diving into the invisible infrastructure that runs the world and the silent war being fought over who controls it. The internet isn't in the cloud. Let's start by destroying a myth. When you hear about the cloud, you probably imagine data floating wirelessly through satellites in space. The reality is far more physical. The internet is a series of cables, undersea cables, thick as garden hoses, laid across the ocean floor, connecting continents. These cables are technological marvels. A single modern cable can carry 400 terabits per second. That's enough bandwidth for millions of people to stream 4K video simultaneously. They're built in layers, fiber optic strands in the core, surrounded by steel wires, copper sheathing for power, and protective coating. They're designed to last 25 years on the ocean floor, withstanding pressure, currents, and marine life. But here's what nobody tells you. They're surprisingly fragile. Ship anchors accidentally cut cables regularly. Underwater earthquakes sever them. Even sharks have been documented biting through cables, possibly attracted by electromagnetic fields. When a cable breaks, entire regions can lose internet access for days or weeks until repair ships can locate and fix the break. And repair ships are slow, specialized, and limited in number. Now imagine those cuts aren't accidents. Imagine they're coordinated attacks, the choke points. The global cable network isn't evenly distributed. It has choke points, geographic bottlenecks where multiple critical cables converge. The Red Sea is one. Roughly 17 major cables pass through this narrow corridor between Africa and Asia, carrying data between Europe, Asia, and Africa. In 2024, Houthi rebels in Yemen began threatening these cables as part of their campaign against Israel and Western shipping. The damage would be catastrophic. Europe's connection to Asia could be severed. Financial markets in London and Singapore suddenly cut off from each other. Supply chains dependent on real-time data would freeze. The Strait of Malacca is another choke point. This narrow passage between Malaysia and Indonesia sees dozens of cables passing through. Control this strait, and you control digital Asia. The Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines is particularly terrifying. If China invades Taiwan, one of their first moves would likely be cutting the undersea cables connecting Taiwan to the world. Taiwan would be digitally isolated before the first shot is fired. Egypt controls another critical junction where cables from Europe pass through the Suez region into the Red Sea. In 2008, multiple cable cuts near Egypt disrupted internet service for millions across the Middle East and India. The official explanation was ship anchors. Intelligence agencies weren't so sure. These choke points are the Achilles heel of the global internet, and everyone knows it. Who's mapping the ocean floor? Here's where things get genuinely creepy. In recent years, there's been a dramatic increase in oceanographic research vessels operating near undersea cables. Russian naval ships equipped with deep-sea submersibles have been tracked loitering near critical cable routes in the North Atlantic and Mediterranean. These aren't fishing boats. They're military vessels with the capability to operate at depths where cables sit. In 2015, the New York Times reported that Russian submarines and spy ships were operating near undersea cables in ways that worried U.S. military and intelligence officials. The concern wasn't just surveillance, it was the capability to cut cables during a conflict. China has built the world's largest fleet of oceanographic research vessels. Officially, they're studying marine life and geology. But these ships spend suspicious amounts of time near cable landing sites and along cable routes. The Chinese ship Shangyang Hongzhou 3, for example, has been tracked systematically surveying cable routes in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It carries underwater drones capable of reaching the ocean floor. The implication is clear. Potential adversaries are mapping where the cables are, understanding the network architecture, and possibly preparing to cut them. The Taiwan cable scenario. Let's walk through the nightmare scenario that keeps Pentagon planners up at night. Taiwan is connected to the global internet by roughly a dozen undersea cables. Most of these cables make landfall on Taiwan's western coast, the side facing China. If China decides to invade Taiwan, step one would be cutting these cables. Not all of them, just enough to cripple Taiwan's ability to communicate with the outside world and coordinate a defense. Taiwan's military communications would be degraded. Its financial system would be isolated from global markets. International media couldn't easily report what's happening. Taiwan's government couldn't rally international support in real time. China doesn't need submarines to do this. They could use underwater drones, special forces divers, or even civilian fishing vessels equipped with cable-cutting tools. The operation could be blamed on an accident, an earthquake, or left deliberately ambiguous. By the time anyone figured out what happened, Taiwan could be digitally dark. And here's the terrifying part. There's almost nothing Taiwan can do to prevent it. You can't defend hundreds of miles of cable sitting on the ocean floor. The surveillance capability. But cutting cables is just one threat. The other is tapping them. In the 1970s, the U.S. Navy ran a classified operation called Ivy Bells, where American submarines secretly attached listening devices to Soviet undersea communication cables in the Sea of Okhotsk. The operation was astonishingly bold. Navy divers worked in freezing water at dangerous depths to physically tap cables on the ocean floor without the Soviets knowing. It worked for years. The U.S. intercepted vast amounts of Soviet military communications until a betrayal by an NSA analyst exposed the operation. That was 50 years ago. The technology has advanced dramatically since then. Modern cable tapping doesn't require physical intervention. Sophisticated devices can detect the faint light leaking from fiber optic cables and decode the data without ever cutting or touching the cable itself. Edward Snowden's leaks revealed that the NSA and GCHQ were intercepting data from undersea cables at landing stations, the facilities where cables come ashore. Programs like Tempora gave British intelligence access to huge volumes of international communications. If Western intelligence agencies can do this, so can China, Russia, and anyone else with the technology and resources. Your encrypted WhatsApp message traveling from New York to London might pass through cables that are being actively monitored by multiple intelligence agencies simultaneously. Who owns the cables? Here's where it gets geopolitically messy. Undersea cables are mostly privately owned, built and operated by telecom companies and increasingly by tech giants. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon have invested billions in building their own undersea cable networks. Google alone has stakes in over 30 cables globally. Why? Because these companies carry so much traffic that it's cheaper to build their own infrastructure than rent capacity from telecom providers. But this creates a new problem. Critical global infrastructure is now owned by private corporations, not governments. In a conflict, whose side would these companies be on? If the U.S. government ordered Google to cut off cable access to China, would Google comply? Could they even technically do it without disrupting their own services? And what about Chinese involvement? Huawei Marine, a subsidiary of the controversial telecom giant, has built or upgraded roughly 100 undersea cables globally. This means Chinese companies have detailed knowledge of cable routes, landing stations, and network architecture across much of the developing world. The U.S. has been pressuring allies to exclude Huawei from cable projects, arguing it creates security vulnerabilities. But for many countries, Huawei offers financing and expertise that Western companies don't match. The repair ship problem. Let's talk about something nobody thinks about: cable repair ships. There are only about 60 specialized cable repair ships in the world. These vessels carry the equipment and expertise to locate breaks, retrieve cable from the ocean floor, splice in new sections, and relay the cable. When a cable breaks, one of these ships has to travel to the break site, often thousands of miles away, locate the damage, and spend days or weeks making repairs. Now imagine a conflict where dozens of cables are cut simultaneously across multiple oceans. There aren't enough repair ships to respond. Prioritizing which cables to fix first becomes a strategic decision with global consequences. During World War I, one of Britain's first acts was cutting Germany's undersea telegraph cables, forcing German communications to route through channels Britain could monitor. It was a decisive intelligence advantage. A modern version of this tactic would be catastrophic. Cut enough cables, and you've crippled an adversary's economy without firing a shot. The alternative. That doesn't exist. You might be thinking, what about satellites? Couldn't we just use satellite internet as backup? The short answer is no, not at the scale we need. Satellite internet, even with new constellations like Starlink, has fundamental limitations: higher latency, lower bandwidth, weather interference, and limited capacity compared to cables. A single undersea cable can carry more data than thousands of satellites combined. Cables carry 99% of intercontinental traffic for a reason: physics. Satellites are useful for remote areas and backup communications, but they can't replace the cable network, not even close. This means there's no plan B. If the cable network is severely damaged, the global internet fragments. We'd revert to regional networks with limited international connectivity. International business would grind to a halt. Financial markets would freeze. Supply chains would collapse. It would be an economic catastrophe comparable to a major war, achieved entirely underwater. What's being done? The scary answer is, not nearly enough. Some countries are starting to take the threat seriously. The UK has designated undersea cables as critical national infrastructure and is investing in monitoring systems. NATO has acknowledged the threat and increased surveillance of cable routes in the North Atlantic. The U.S. Navy has reactivated the Second Fleet, partially to protect undersea infrastructure from Russian interference. But these are reactive measures. The fundamental problem remains: you can't defend hundreds of thousands of miles of cable spread across the ocean floor. Some proposals include redundant cable routes to reduce single points of failure, better monitoring systems to detect tampering, international agreements protecting cables as critical infrastructure, faster repair capabilities with more ships and pre-positioned equipment. But implementation is slow, and the threat is growing faster than the defenses. The bottom line. Right now, beneath the ocean, the global economy runs through cables you never see and rarely think about. These cables are the invisible nervous system of modern civilization. They carry everything: commerce, communications, intelligence, entertainment, the entire digital world. And they're surprisingly vulnerable to anyone with the capability and will to cut them. We've built a hyper-connected global system on fragile infrastructure that we largely can't defend and barely monitor. The silent war over these cables isn't coming. It's already here. Nations are mapping them, testing capabilities, preparing for the day when the first move in a conflict isn't a missile strike, but a severed cable. When the next major war comes, it might not start with explosions you can see. It might start with your internet cutting out. And by the time you realize what's happened, the world will have already changed. The question isn't whether these cables will be targeted. The question is when, and whether we'll be ready. This has been your deep dive into the infrastructure nobody talks about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.